Welcome to Conversation with the Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're really fortunate to have Billie Lee Turner, professor emeritus at Arizona State University. Billie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, glad to be here.
As I've discussed with many people on this series, I'd like to get an idea as to what might have inspired you to pursue geography. Could you reflect upon your childhood and maybe and a bit more about your upbringing? Maybe comment on some episodes of that period in your life that might have sparked an interest in geography, and then go on to talk about your undergraduate studies and your graduate studies?
Well, certainly. It's often, I think, when one addresses this question to geographers, they scratch their head because they're trying to think what in the distant past led to the decision to become a geographer. In my particular case, if I reflect back on it, I think it had much to do with my upbringing, and particularly my father. He was a botanist, a desert botanist at the University of Texas. As a kid, I was interested in sports. I didn't know what I wanted to do other than play sports, which I wasn't very good at. So anyway, my father constantly was putting us in a car and driving out to the field to collect plants. And I spent much of my youth sitting in the back seat of the car looking at landscapes and wondering, why is that hill over there? Why is that hillside have houses on it, but the other hillside doesn't have houses on it? Now, that didn't reflect into me choosing geography when I went to college. In fact, I did my freshman year at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and I was in political science, as I thought maybe I wanted to go into the Foreign Service. Then I left Miami and went back to the University of Texas, where I grew up in Austin. And I took a geography course and an anthropology course simultaneously. And in that, I realized that both allowed me to look at landscapes, but they wanted me to look at landscapes in slightly different ways. But regardless, in both, I discovered something at the time, which was called cultural ecology. And that excited me. That really excited me, and I had to decide whether that would be anthropology or geography to pursue that field of study. And I chose geography largely because it gave me much more latitude in the course selections that I could take. Anthropology had a much more prescribed set of courses that one had to take, and some of those I just wasn't particularly interested in.
Do you recall your professors in geography in Austin at the time?
Well, yes, I do. But I think what's very important about that for me is not so much the undergraduate level geography professors, but I was fortunate enough to take so many courses that my senior year at the University of Texas, I was qualified to take a series of seminars at the graduate level. Right? And so I just moved right into a master's degree. And at that time, Texas had a few people who had just come in that really did influence me. And foremost was a gentleman that I think most geographers today, the young geographers, wouldn't know, an individual named Fred Simoons. And Fred Simoons was a classic Berkeley Sarwinian geographer.
Used to wear a bow tie.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
You went to Davis. Yeah.
Right. Oh, okay. And Fred only stayed 1 year at the University of Texas, but he took me under his wing and basically first told me that I didn't know how to write and I didn't know how to think logically or concisely. And he was going to teach me how. And he worked with me literally on a day-by-day basis. I think I learned more how to write professionally under Fred Simoons than any individual I can think of. At the time, I fell in love because my father had been to Africa and come back with these incredible slides of landscapes and peoples, that I was going to do cultural ecology in Africa. And Fred, of course, did questions of pastoral nomadism and whatnot. And so that was a very good fit. But he left after 1 year to go to Davis, to Cal Davis. So I didn't follow him to Cal Davis, even though I realized after the fact that he sent me all sorts of signals, to follow him. And that's where my father sort of stepped in. My father hardly ever gave me any advice whatsoever about graduate education other than this. And I think it was very important. He said, don't go to a place where there's just one individual with whom you can work. Go to some place where there are multiple individuals where you can work with. And the reasons for that is you never really know where you're going to go once you enter graduate school. You may think you're going to do X and you'll end up doing Y. And that's exactly what happened. Had I gone to Davis and worked with Fred, I'm sure that I would have done well. But by taking the choice that I did, I had different kinds of opportunities that serendipitously moved me into the directions that I moved in.
And you went to Madison.
Yes, I actually was drafted. I got my master's degree and was immediately drafted during the Vietnam War period. Fortunately, I didn't have to go to Vietnam. I was sent to Germany instead. I then applied to various schools, and Madison was the one that not only accepted me, but gave me, I thought, the best opportunities for what I wanted to do. So I showed up at the University of Wisconsin, and it turned out that all their Africanists had left for whatever reason. So they had 2 or 3, now they had none. The only person they had that did cultural ecology was a fantastic individual named William Denevan. And he took me under his wing and he said, you can work with me, but not in Africa. You have to work in Latin America. Mm-hmm. So that's that serendipity that I'm talking about, where you think you're going to do one thing and you end up doing another. And then the actual original work that I did was, again, serendipity. Bill said there's an archaeological project that's going to go on in Yucatan. See if you can find a problem that you can work on. And so I started reading all the literature on Mayan archaeology that had to do with essentially how people use landscapes. What's the degree of the transformation of landscapes that were involved? What kind of agricultural systems? I had been working theoretically on work that the famous economist Esther Boserup had been working on. And my conclusion after reading the minutia, actually, of the archaeology was that they were all wrong. Well, the Mayanists were all wrong. That if they had the levels of population that the archaeologists were coming up with at the time, they couldn't have possibly had the agricultural systems that the archaeologists were talking about. And so I was going to go down and find the landscape relics.
And this is just after there was a revolution, really, in reassessing Indian populations, really, in the Americas, Native American populations. Yes. I mean, I think one of the early pioneers in these studies was Dobbins, who really created a depopulation ratio that indicated that perhaps the figures that had been accepted then recently were perhaps 95% less or fewer than they had been actually, if I remember correctly. Is it right?
Something exactly something on that line. Yeah. And Denevan, my mentor, had picked up on all that line of work and had given, if you would, the new estimates of populations of Native Americans across all the Americas at large. And so he, of course, was very interested in this whole notion, if there were a lot of Mayans, what implications and whatnot. So that got me off onto that particular topic, and that evolved. That was my cultural ecology, if you would, linking past human-environment relationships predicated on contemporary theory that were appropriate. And so basically, I should say one other thing that a mentor that I should point out at Wisconsin at the time was a young man named Robert Sack. And he had just come from the University of Minnesota, and he was sort of a philosopher of geography. And I took a lot of courses with him and learned just an immense amount of what ultimately I think would improve my way of understanding geographical thinking and whatnot. What's very interesting is, of course, Bob was a great believer in geography as a chorological science, that it's a science, predicated on something about space, place, and whatnot, which didn't quite fit the human environment theme that I would say the Berkeley geographers came from, and that I was Bill Donovan was a Berkeley student as well. But it gave me a great a feeling for then what the human environmental people in geography, how they saw the field versus the spatial people and how they saw the field. When I ultimately was hired by Clark University, one of the reasons of going there, for me anyway, was that it was a program that had virtually no spatial in it whatsoever. It was basically a human environment based program led by the great Bob Cates.
This was just a couple of years after Saul Cohen left, isn't it?
Yes, Saul Cohen, when I got there, in fact, my position was a position that was created for a bunch of junior faculty because Saul Cohen had left. And of course, I guess his position held enough dollars to support 2 or 3 young people coming into the program at the time.
Well, yes. He built the department when it had really fallen. From
yes,
the time
that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. And I was very fortunate to go there at the time. I want to say several things about going there for people who are young geographers in any of the field. The first was it was human environment in its orientation, but it was human environment as it came out of the Chicago School of Gilbert White. Right? So
White.
they were They were interested in contemporary problems about risk and hazard, and how do you help society apropos the study of environmental hazards and whatnot, which was very different from the Berkeley School of Human Environment Geography. And so which was much more historical in kind, had a stronger cultural element into it, wasn't necessarily interested in solving social problems, per se. To go to a program that does human environment, but in a very different way, was really eye-opening to me, and it made a huge impact on the way I thought about geography and handled the problems in geography.
So you really experienced in yourself sort of a shift in your personal paradigm from that which was heavily influenced by Donovan now to one that is becoming influenced by White through Cates in a way. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. Bob and I actually, I wouldn't say arguing is not a good word, but let's say we bantered back and forth when I first arrived about X, Y, and Z. And I'm pretty sure that Bob didn't put me as the first person he would wanted to hire, that he would vote for, because I was too Berkeley, I think, in my orientation to work. But after he saw, let's put it this way, after I was there for a few years, he took me under his wing. And he became my, if you would, third mentor. I mentioned Fred Simoons, Bill Donovan. Well, Cates became my, after the graduation and doctorate degree mentor. And, helped to direct me in various ways and introduced me to the kinds of programs and questions to ask and whatnot that I think helped to uh, elevate my career. Another person who also helped me at the time was being at Clark. I was right next door to Harvard, and Harvard had the most esteemed Mayan archaeologist out there named Gordon Willie. And Gordon Willie, based upon the work that I'd done on my doctoral dissertation, invited me to work on his projects. So now I had two very well-known individuals, both members of the National Academy of Sciences, Gordon Willie and Robert Cates, helping me, in my career, in the sense of appreciating what I was doing, but at the same time helping to direct me
And
in
this
various
is
ways.
and this is at a time when there is quite a bit of interest in the Maya that is also generated by National Geographic with Stewart there.
Yes. Yes, in fact, the NGS actually hired me to go on a trip with them, throughout the Yucatan, which ultimately resulted in a big piece that they had on the Maya. Yes, the Maya, of course, while geographers at large were not particularly interested in the Maya, right? That's not something that would have been high on the agenda. The larger community out there was. Meaning there was a big public community interested in it, and a huge element of archaeology that was interested in that issue. What that did, and I think what resonated with Bob Cates, one of Bob Cates's big themes was that geographers tend not to ask really big, important questions, right, that either academia or society wants answered. He recognized that what I was working on with Gordon Willie was one of those questions, one of those big questions to try to resolve. And he enjoyed that immensely. Bob did, because that was one of his, if I can call it, shticks, right? That ask the big question and then go out and attempt to solve it. So that was really an interesting time because as you pointed out, Saul Cohen had resurrected, if you would, a program that was in some sort of disarray. Then he left to become president at another university. And during that time that I was there, we were able to hire Susan Hansen. I just can't go down the line of people that gravitated to Clark. And by the time I left was the time that the National Research Council had done some rankings of all graduate programs, and we ended up tied for first. And, I think it's silly to start saying year one, year two, year three, but the point I'm trying to say is as foundational as Saul had brought the program up to a certain point, we had never been that high in assessments. And so I was very, very fortunate to go to a funky school. And what I mean funky, Clark is really an odd place. It's basically a liberal arts college that has 3 or 4 PhD programs in it. But one of those that has become very, very vital is, of course, the Graduate School of Geography there. And to be there at a time when it was in its effervescence was really a wonderful case. We dominated human environment. That's what we did. We had a lot of good and early remote sensing that went on as well. And what was very interesting, we always had a critical theory group present at Clark. So there was always this tension, if you would. I would say a healthy tension between different ways of seeing the world and how you create problems and try to resolve those problems. So it was a wonderful time to be there.
I had the opportunity to talk to Saul when I was interviewing him for my book that was published several years ago on leadership in American academic geography, and we we chatted a bit about Clark, and he indicated to me that unlike other geography programs in the U.S. that tended to oftentimes be insular, only looking at other geographers to hire that were oftentimes focused in particular areas, he sought out individuals with interdisciplinary interests. And he was not afraid to hire somebody who was stellar and captivating that might not have been able to get hired in a typical geography program.
Yes, that's true, and it pervaded the entire time I was there. That was the way we operated. That would have been what Bob would have supported as well. That Bob on a daily basis was working with any and everyone that wasn't a geographer. Because his role with the academy and whatnot, he was one of the few geographers there. He would always come back in fact, I have a very good, when I did my first review, at the program, one of the questions asked me is, why was I publishing in geography journals? Which was, I thought, sort of interesting in one respect, but the point that was trying to be made was that there's a greater community beyond geography, of which geography can communicate and contribute to, and that geographers should engage in it.
Absolutely. Well, I recall you speaking, inferring upon that subject in your discussion of cultural ecology at the Phoenix AAG meeting in the late 80s, maybe. You and Donald Meinig were keynote speakers, and the delivery of each of your addresses was very well received by all at this meeting in Phoenix. And there was some elaboration really on the importance of our discipline reaching out, moving beyond just that particular focus that so many had embraced.
Right.
I
remember that that turned into an article that we did publish in the Annals.
Yeah, in a geography journal.
Yeah. Yes. But the point there that I was trying to make anyway, and I think others really believed in, was to really be a good geographer, you not only have to speak to your discipline, you have to speak beyond the discipline, right? That in one sense, you had to be the classic synthesizer that many geographers were, but you also had to be able to make that synthesis cross over to the way other people pose the problem, other disciplines pose the problem, and I remember that quite well, largely because that was one of the first times that I ran into Carl Butzer. And Carl, of course, was a great believer in human environmental science, human environmental geography.
Right. He had gone to Texas from Chicago just briefly before that.
Yeah, that's correct. And that always... one of the things that I've done from time to time, I want you to understand, or I should make it clear to everyone, that I'm not an individual that's trying to tell you that geography is about human environment science or geography is about spatial science. What I'm here to tell you is both are present in the discipline and do very well in the discipline. But one of the things I used to like to do to the chorological or spatial group is begin a discussion with who are the most honorific geographers I can think of, meaning, having more of the great nobody's a Nobel laureate, but having those kinds of credentials. And you would start with Gilbert White, who had, right, and then you would have maybe Bob Cates, and then maybe you would have Carl Butzer, and you start going down and looking at these incredible figures who always were in geography, promoted geography, were champions of the field, and yet at the same time were clearly human environment in their orientation and not sort of the chorological spatial in kind. So that's a message I hope that we get across in this particular episode.
Well, that's an interesting contention, and I think it's a pretty profound message for sure. You know, so you were at Clark for how many years at Clark? Were you there?
28 years.
That's, and then you went to Arizona State.
I went to Arizona State. I had two reasons. Well, I shouldn't say two, but the main reason my wife at the time suffered from a really bad genetic issue. And she got to the point where when cold weather came along, she almost even couldn't talk. Her muscles would tighten up, and she just had to get into warm weather. Right. So then why go to Arizona State? I had chances to go into the Florida. I had chances to go back to Texas. I went to Arizona State because they had an incredible president that we still have, Michael Crow, who just had a radically different vision about what higher education should be and what university should be. And among the things that he did is he essentially tore down all classical departments and rearranged them into schools. He didn't do that just to tear them down. He did it because he asked the question, is the historical division of disciplines, that comes from the 17th century Germany, the way they should be for the 21st century? And therefore, he was experimenting with all different ways of addressing questions, including human environmental ones. And he had invigorated the Department of Geography. The program had brought in some really outstanding people, and I thought, okay, I'll go join that and see what we can do. Another reason is I knew that Arizona State had the capacity to bring in anyone of high quality that we could get to come. And what do I mean by that? Meaning that you didn't have to go through a dean, a committee, and whatnot to ultimately get a position. You could go straight to the president, and you could say, I can get Professor X to come to this place, and he would look at it and decide if it's any good and say, sure, let's do it. And that way we were able to fashion a program or build a program very rapidly. The negative in it, I should tell everyone, the negative is outstanding people have great opportunities to leave at all times and are constantly being picked away by other programs. And so we've gone through that stress. So we built and we lose, and then we rebuild as well.
Well, there's something to be said for creating a community of exemplary geographers, because there's so much interaction that can take place and solid mentoring that can take place among colleagues, like you yourself experienced in your early days at Clark. I think in a lot of places we have lost that today in academia, where there are too frequently unhealthy competitions in departments, it seems. Not in all places, but in a lot.
I think that's happened. I think historically that's actually happened in geography. Let's say more than it should. Fortunately, I have never been really in those circumstances. At Clark, we had a very good functioning program. We might disagree, but everyone produced, and you negotiated it with you intellectually across different viewpoints. And I would say that's the same thing we have at Arizona State today. But I think I see that across the discipline at large. I don't see, at least in my mind, the tensions between different ways of seeing the world or different ways you want to approach geography. But one reason that may be, and it would be interesting to see if you agree with this, is because programs, it seems to me, at least the bigger programs, the ones that have multiple, up to 20 people in it and whatnot, no longer try to cover all of geography. Geography is very expansive. You have humanists, you have hardcore scientists, which is in one way quite innovative and interesting. And in fact, I'll give you an example in a moment about why that's a positive thing. But that's where often the tension arises when you try to cover everything. And so I see increasingly today you have programs, I think of the University of Maryland is really focused on remote sensing. Santa Barbara really focuses on spatial GIS, all right? Kentucky has, at least until recently, focused on critical theory. So I would suspect because of that, you don't have maybe the tensions that come about. The positive about having that great breadth, which I would think maybe just a few programs that are large programs like UCLA may have that great breadth, is that it creates a researcher academic who somehow has some affiliation to cross from the hard science to the humanities. And so as we get all these interdisciplinary activities taking place at the national level in a variety of ways, the geographer is often the one person, right, who can cross what those efforts are attempting to do. The biggest one, I would argue, is sustainability science.
Sure.
So sustainability science, right, in which you have whole questions about equity and justice on one side, and you questions about what are the dynamics of the biophysical system on the other, and you're supposed to bring it all together. And the geographers have really been the ones who have been able to step in and fill that, if you would, gap of how do you bring that all together.
Well, there very well might be something to what you were saying with regard to most programs in geography facilitating one or a few specializations in the field rather than reaching across this eclectic field to be all things to all people. Again, as you mentioned, UCLA might be an exception, and there are probably a couple of other departments that might be like that. But I think another factor might very well be that there just are not as many doctoral programs in geography as there were in the last century and the later part of the last century, as Michigan, Northwestern, Chicago, Harvard and Yale had essentially vanished. So there have been numerous losses that might have also facilitated some of this interest in specializing. And maybe those are messages that have come from higher levels of administration. Maybe presidents and provosts and deans have indicated to departments, you have to follow a certain theme or create a theme for all of you to pursue. I've seen that in some cases.
Yeah. I think that's one reason. I think another is that geography, if you look at many of the places that were closed down in geography, they just couldn't compete with the other programs in the institutions on the metrics that the deans were looking at, such as sponsored research, right? So Santa Barbara, in taking the orientation they took, has access to, let's say, the capacity or the potential to bring in lots of research money, so they stack up well by the metrics that the university's looking at. Yeah.
And in a sense, the effort to focus in one or a few areas is pragmatic. partly because of the grant funding that is needed to support a department, which is probably considerably higher than it was, decades ago.
Right. And as well, when you bring in multiple people in a certain topical area, whatnot, right, you get the synergies that comes from that activity. Yeah.
Sure. Now you were chair for a while at Clark, isn't that correct?
Yeah, I think about 12 or 14. I can't remember exactly. Not all at once, but off and on about 12 or 14.
Would you care to comment on some or provide some insight concerning formal leadership as a chair and maybe informal leadership as well as a colleague? Would you care to comment on some attributes that you believe are productive or enhance productivity, enhance departmental vitality?
Well, of course, just having good people is critical, and having great graduate students is really critical. And I must say that I've been very fortunate in that regard, because I had just a slew of them at both of the institutions I've been at the longest. That's a really good question. Bob Cates used to tell me, Billie, you might do well as a director, but tell me what's your big theme, what's your big strategy, what are you trying to achieve? And I used to realize that I never stopped and thought about those. Not the way Bob did, right? Bob would have a strategy and a theme of thing he's going for. My strategy or theme, if you would, that I had was simply I wanted to, well, at the time at Clark, we were an exciting place, but we were not attracting the kinds of graduate students that other places wanted. You know what I mean by that? We had very few people at the other really well-known geography programs. And so one of my strategies was, how do we build a more enthusiastic and high quality number of graduate students coming into the program to play off of the quality of the faculty that we had. So that became my strategy. One of the strategies that I was after. But the other issue that you're raising, which is what do you do on a day-to-day basis, for instance, to keep up? Well, you have to be honest. That's the first thing. Even some of the people that we think of as being great leaders and have encountered from time to time problems of not being totally honest, with the situation. And I think that you do have to be you have to be straightforward. You have to be able to give your opinion in a straightforward and honest way with your faculty and your students. What you can't do is make all faculty think that whatever they're saying is what you're going to do. Whatever they're saying is the correct way to interpret the world. You have to be observant to what they're saying, listen to what they're saying, take from what those around you are advising, but you have to come back to them with, here is where I'm going, here's why I'm going in that particular direction, and be straightforward about that. And even if you don't like a particular area, let's just say for a moment that you have a cluster of faculty members who are doing a particular kind of work that maybe you as an individual would prefer that we were doing something else. You have to appreciate what it is that they're doing and help sponsor and focus the program to best facilitate what it is that is what they're doing. So I know I'm coming back and saying the word honesty over and over again, but I do think that leadership in academia particularly requires hardcore honesty.
It's interesting you should mention that, and I think about where you had been, and I don't know that much about Oklahoma's department at the time you were there, but I know that Wisconsin in the 60s anyway, and in part of the 70s, was not really considered to be a place where there was a lot of transparency as far as the leadership in the department went.
Mm.
And then you arrive at Clark, and Cates is basically steering the ship. And I have to think about Gilbert White, who was a model of morality, I guess, in American academic geography.
Yes.
You know. And I wonder about these influences and how much of your impression came from White via Cates.
Well, that, it is interesting. Both of those gentlemen were very formal in the way they presented themselves publicly. I'm a little less formal in the way I present myself publicly, especially when I was young and even a director at Clark. I was prone to tell people straight to their face that your work's no good, something like that. And Bob would always sort of, without ever saying, pay attention to me, would show me a different way of addressing that, right? That if something isn't the way it should be, you don't have to say it publicly, those kinds of things. Having said that, at the same time, and understand that I love the man, and he was a great man. Bob would lead things, but not necessarily in the most direct fashion. So yes, even while we got along at Clark quite well, at the same time, we had some internal tensions because maybe Bob wanted to see the program go this way. There were other faculty who wanted to see it perhaps go another way, and Bob knew how to manipulate things in ways that the other people didn't. So it wasn't always straightforward and obvious in the way he did. I can't speak to Gilbert because I never, was with Gilbert in the sense that he was over me, and I was in a program with him. But the point I'm trying to make is, even though we all have our idiosyncrasies, we all have our ways of doing things that are different. At the same time, if there is a level of respect and honesty that's involved, you can get past all the tensions that could take place. And I think you're absolutely right. If you want to talk about our discipline, there is this history that we have of where these tensions have pulled us apart.
Indeed. We have just a minute or two left to go here. I'm going to ask you to reflect upon the path that you've trod, where you've been in academic geography, and consider what advice you might have for an undergraduate student interested in geography, or graduate students completing their theses or dissertations, and even colleagues in the field. Do you have any advice you'd like to share, or any words of wisdom you'd like to share?
Well, that you should, the number one thing is, whatever you're working, if you decide you want to become an academic, you should love whatever it is that you're engaging. That could be teaching, right? That could be graduate mentoring. That could be the research area that you work in. But the point is, if you don't wake up every morning and want to do it, that it's in your heart and you have to be there to do it, you should think about something else. That's sort of a big issue. The sort of professional issue I point out is something I said at the very beginning. I think geographers could perhaps make a bigger splash in the world if they were able to take on problems big problems that society and the research community believes are the big problems. When I'll give some examples, right? Certainly when Goodchild, invested in the whole notion of GI science, that was a big problem. Meaning, right, does such a field exist? If such a field exists, how do you articulate it? And I could go on and give others. Bob Cates in the human environmental sciences. This is very interesting. When Bob not only helps to create, you can also say that Carl Sauer helped to create the human environmental sciences. That's how we got geography in the National Academy.
Mm-hmm.
We now have 14, 15, a number of people in our National Academy of Sciences, but we didn't get them there by claiming there had to be a geography section. In fact, we tried to do that and they said no. But by recognizing that there were elements of the spatial and elements of the human environment that could be brought together, right? Mm-hmm. That permeated with the rest of the Academy members, and they felt comfortable with that. So thinking of the big question and helping to resolve that big question as opposed to always doing some, small step. It's not that small steps shouldn't be done. Of course they should. But at the same time, can we have more people that are asking those really, really big questions? I think often those that we do have that do that often are siphoned off from geography into other disciplines, right?
Sometimes that happens, yes. Unfortunately for us as geographers. And I think that we have to be unafraid of failure and just dream big and pursue those big things like you're talking about.
I think I wished I'd said it, what you just said.
Go ahead. You can have it. Billie, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a great pleasure.
Well, it's been lovely, and thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I'm honored. This concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.